the first session where we've investigated some of the complexities that have sort of arisen in our operations in shared facilities. I've never been at a session where we discussed this topic, so it is for a reason that this topic is coming up now. I think most of us have come from institutions where core facilities were mom and pop, and we have seen over the years how the scope has grown. They've also grown in scale, and the things that we need to be doing at speed are multiplying. So you get these complexities in the way the equipment is onboarded. The whole life cycle needs to be managed more at a much larger scale. So the relationship between ourselves as shared facilities, industry, and university has always been at arm's length. I think from this point, I think you must agree with me that for most of your initiatives, you're going to be working very, very closely with what we used to call our vendors, who Ken has asked us to really reflect on that, to call them solution providers. So today you see a close relationship between a solution provider in an area that is increasingly becoming more important but complex, work together to come up with policies, processes, and procedures to make life easier for us. So we have today, the slides are they moving too fast? Okay. So as you can see, the complexity of our institutions can be represented by these numbers. You know, we are increasingly working in the millions. We are increasingly saving like 140,000 hours, so which means institutions are increasingly relying on us. And the asset base that we manage are mid-scale to large-scale companies. So we are now expected to be better stewards of these assets and to deploy them much efficiently. So that requires us to work in a different way than we had before. So I have here my colleagues, I would say, Nick, from Nick and Deborah. They will showcase how a close working relationship between a solution provider and a shared facility or institution look like. So Nick, can you take it off from us?
Absolutely. Hi, thank you everyone for joining us today. And I can hop right up there. Thank you to Claudius for advocating for this session and bringing us in to have this conversation with you all today. So I'm Nick Borkowski. I'm with First American Equipment Finance. I work within specifically our higher ed division. In our education division, we've got over 1,000 clients, and that is from K-12 all the way on up through higher education. First American's got about 30 plus years of experience serving education institutions. We are a bank-owned lessor. So we are owned by City National Bank, part of the Royal Bank of Canada. Our finance portfolio, so this is projects and equipment that we have financed that's sitting in our portfolio at any given time, is currently sitting at about $4 billion. And we employ, out of our 300 employees, out of our headquarters office in Rochester, New York, we have over 150 certified lease and finance professionals, which is more than any other lessor in the U.S., which we're very proud of. So very excited to be with you all here today to dive in on this topic, and I'll let Debbie do her introduction. Would you like to do your intro quick?
Okay. Yes. Sorry. We're trading off speakers, so we'll get better at this. So thank you and welcome. And I do want to thank Claudius and Nick and ABRF Planning Committee for giving me this opportunity to share our experiences with buying, leasing grants, as well as instrumentation grant solutions. So I'm going to give you a case scenario a little later on in the talk about how we've started with leasing and how it shaped our decisions and processes. But a little bit about the university and school. So I am at Rutgers University. It is a very large school with multiple campuses and 4 chancellorhoods. Chancellor units, chancellor-run units. So there are 2 R1 schools and 2 R2 schools. So very broad range of undergraduates, graduate programs, and we have within the Chancellor unit that I am in is Rutgers Biomedical and Health Sciences. A short term now, we're calling ourselves Rutgers Health. And Rutgers Health includes 2 medical schools, one in Newark, where I'm located, and one in New Brunswick. We're actually looking to merge into one large medical school soon. A nursing school, dental school, School of Health Professions. Also, Rutgers Health does include the pharmacy school and other related institutes and centers of excellence that do biomedical research. So we're a very big unit within Rutgers. And we have partnered with our local hospital, RWJ Barnabas, to expand and achieve excellence for academic research in Newark throughout the state. And with that came a lot of money to help us recruit faculty and grow our enterprise, both our excellence and emerging areas of excellence in research. And with that came really an exponential growth. We were hiring, let's say, NIH tenure track faculty at 1 every 4 years. Now we're hiring 4 to 5 a year, and this has been the case for at least 8 years now. So to actually address that growth, as well as address the advancing technologies like spatial biology that are really, really important for bringing forward biomedical research, we have tried to look at a lot of different solutions for raising funds for equipment. And we're going to talk about one that is new for us, but actually has afforded us a lot of flexibility in addition to the other sponsored and internal grant programs that we run. So I am an administrative director as well as the associate dean for research at the medical school. I oversee 8 cores, actually 9 cores I think now, and then 2 emerging cores. So we're growing core facilities as well as the faculty base. And it's been pretty exciting. I'm a researcher by trade, so I love being close to the research, even though now I do the administration. And I used to work in core facilities in the past, so it's sort of a good fit for me. But as you'll see, there's a lot of business process behind running core facilities, as you guys know, and acquiring instruments and convincing leadership that it's a good value proposition to do leases versus sponsored programs to fund research. We have done very well. So as I said, we have grown our faculty base, but we also have faculty that are getting very large grants, a lot of team science growth. We have very strong infectious disease and immunology, but also neurobiology, cancer, a very broad range of expertise. And so it's been pretty exciting, but you can imagine the new emerging technology is exceptionally important for these faculty to be successful. They have been. We generally in the past had run about 40 million in NIH-funded programs and overall 85 million in total sponsored. We're now at 60 to 70 million of NIH-funded grants and a total of 120 million for sponsored programs, and that's just New Jersey Medical School. So Rutgers Health itself is about half of the funding that comes into Rutgers as a whole from sponsored programs, and the university is up to about over 900 million now. And when we first became part of Rutgers, we joined as another state university into Rutgers in 2013. From that time on, we've almost doubled our overall, the university has almost doubled NIH-sponsored program funding. So we're in a growth curve, which is very exciting, but when the faculty come and say we need this technology to be competitive, to answer the important questions they're trying to answer, there's been a lot of challenges with that. So we're going to talk about one solution that we've come up with.
So a common theme that many of you have heard throughout the weekend, and probably no surprise to anybody in this room, this was a report that came from the Chronicle of Higher Education about this time last year, really just speaking to the recruitment and retention challenges across higher education. And this was pronounced also, on the research side of the house, as many of you are competing for top faculty at your institutions, especially in markets, right, where they may be more competitive, where you have a neighboring institution close by. And I think this has been, over the last 5 years, speaking on behalf of our higher education group at First American, about 5 years ago, we actually we actually spun off a group within our higher education division that's specifically catering toward building specific programs, master lease programs for R1 and R2 universities. You know, when I started in this business, you know, 10, 11 years ago, I think we were really at a mode where a lot of strategic planning at the institution level was still focused on facility expansion, housing, you know, kind of really more student-facing, you know, type investments. And I would say we've seen a major trend in the last 5 years. There are very few strategic plans that you're hearing right now where the research enterprise is not a top focus, right? If you're an R2 institution, many of those institutions have directives to and are setting paths to become R1. So this was actually a survey of CROs that came out a couple years ago, and they were basically asked to stack rank top priorities if there were new funding sources available. And you know, over 76% of respondents said that if they had new funding mechanisms to invest, their top 1 or 2 priorities would be to refresh, replace, or invest in new equipment to support core facilities. So I think that tees up our conversation nicely for today. And all of you are faced with budgetary challenges, and I think that, you know, as we discuss this topic, we're going to try to bring more resources to the ABRF membership to provide more education around this topic in general, because I think the one thing that's become clear, not only in our work with universities, but in engaging with many of you over the past couple of years, is that there is just a knowledge gap on what the implications are, where these programs are a good fit, what you may be being told by an OEM or an equipment supplier or an individual lessor that's trying to help you place equipment in your facility. And I think what you'll find here too is that there can be very unique considerations based on, for example, the state your institution is located in, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. I think the key here is that folks that are implementing programs like these successfully, you know, it really does allow you to obtain revenue generating equipment that you're going to need while preserving cash for other investments. But really more importantly, it's about how can we use this program as a tool to drive innovation, retain talent, stay competitive, right? So as we think about special applications, which we'll dive into here momentarily, I think just taking a 10,000 feet up version of what these programs are, how they come to be, who the stakeholders are in this space, what types of service providers are out there in this place is just an important foundation to understand. Quick show of hands, has anyone in this room utilized, ever leased a piece of research equipment before? Couple hands, okay. Anybody considered leasing in the past and it just hasn't worked out for whatever reason? It's because you waited till the last minute and brought it to procurement right before they were shutting down for the holidays and they didn't want to do it? Didn't hear that from me. I guess first note that I would put here is you do have to understand that these are financial obligations for your institution now. Years ago, there were certain provisions within leasing equipment and software-based investments for the university which were not really taken into account on the financial statements and the debt considerations for the university. Much of that has changed in the last 2 to 3 years, where now both public and private institutions are required to disclose any lease agreements that they have across the campus, any software as a subscription agreements that they have on campus. You know, the regulators want those commitments accounted for in financial statements. So there's become a big push out of finance offices. When you think about university finance, the treasury office, the controller's office, there's some additional burden on those folks now. You know, and when we started working with Rutgers a decade ago, one of their strategic priorities was that, hey, we have people from OIT entering into leases with manufacturers. We have researchers that are entering into leases with manufacturers. You know, we don't have good record keeping on where these are and who owns them and who's entering into them, and we really need to centralize this process. So the treasurer that they brought in at the time, this was a strategic priority for him to centralize a master lease program that would really streamline both the procurement and administration of leases moving forward. And I see one of our one of my friends from Rochester here in the back of the room. University of Rochester is a great example of an institution that very, very tight process when it comes to leasing equipment. Every single lease that transacts through that university runs through their treasury desk. And that is becoming, we are seeing that become more commonplace because the folks that are managing for the debt for the university want to be aware of these types of transactions. I think sometimes that can scare folks in the research administration side when they know, okay, how many stakeholders are we going to need to get involved here? But I think in our experience, we've seen that proactive conversations around these types of concepts can really, down the road, be a pretty effective means of clearing the runway to do things like this on your campus. So when you think about a master lease program, I think first, there's the legal implications and what is the documentation that's required to get signed. Whether you are leasing through an equipment provider, whether you are leasing through a bank that your institution already has a relationship with, there is a master lease agreement that is associated with that relationship. So that really sets the general business terms and conditions between the university and whomever is going to be supplying the capital and taking any residual risk on the lease. Okay, and we'll talk about different lease structures and how this can form, but I think the reason that that's important is there is typically a procurement that needs to take place in order to establish a program like this. Okay, so establishing a master lease program, there are going to be contract review, legal review, procurement review in order to get that established. There is things that we need to be thinking about. How are we going to handle when we're closing leases out, delivery and acceptance of equipment? We will get into some timing elements on this because it is important for as you're doing your budgetary planning. Those are going to be important considerations with how the lender is going to be looking at this and then how your institution is going to be looking at it, and make sure those two are married. Every single lease typically does so at Rutgers as an example. University of Rochester would be another example. The treasurer signs off on every lease agreement underneath the master agreement. So once the master program is set, typically the university, the Treasury and Finance Office will typically dictate what are allowable assets to finance under this program. We have some institutions that, they're addressing deferred maintenance and equipment acquisitions through these programs. For a client like Rutgers, it's really focused on equipment acquisitions, short-term IT acquisitions, things like that. So you'll want to understand where your treasury sees a fit for a program like this as well. And then approval workflows, I think, is one that Debbie, I know we'll be talking about here, but just important to understand who's going to be involved both locally in your organization and your group, but then university-wide, who are the stakeholders that are going to be involved in that type of decision and approval for each lease that takes down underneath the program. As far as stakeholders, I think I've probably touched on that, but I think primarily we're talking research faculty, research administration, university finance and procurement, and then the OEM instrumentation provider. That is a really important relationship, obviously, in this whole thing as well. Service providers that are in this space. So I mentioned that First American there's three primary types of lessors that are in this space. One being a bank-owned lessor, which is what First American is. Many of your institutions probably have a relationship with a large national bank and a local regional bank. They may have an equipment finance arm. And then you'll see independent finance companies offering these types of solutions, which they can be very effective with the level of customization that they're able to provide. The challenges there tend to be cost of capital with those organizations can be challenging because they are effectively borrowing from banks to fund their business. With bank-owned lessors, you really want to understand what level of customization they're actually able to provide, because typically the larger the bank, the more regulations are placed on them, and inherently the less flexibility they will have. And then what they refer to in our industry, which most of the people in this room are mostly familiar with, is your captive lessors. So this is going to be your, Waters, for example, I see out here in the audience. They have an equipment finance arm within their company. They have a designated team that really handles all those requests that come in for their sales team. So that's probably who most of you have interfaced with. Those are the service providers in this space. Special applications for these types of programs, these are typically the three, I would say, highest demand projects that we are typically involved with, or that I guess I would say at an institution where tends to generate the most interest in a solution like this. Faculty startup packages are becoming increasingly popular with the capital requirements that are involved there, facility renovations, instrumentation acquisitions to recruit that faculty. Lab renovations, fairly standard, and then the purpose of our talk today, investment in core facilities. I would say solutions that we see in this space related to core facilities. The most common needs that we see from clients are, we need a bridge to budget solution, right? So we need to acquire this instrumentation. We may not have it in our budget for this fiscal year, but we do have approval for the funding in future fiscal years. How can we bridge that gap between acquiring the equipment today, but maybe we don't have funding available for 3 to 6 months? So something that is able to be done under these programs when structured the right way. Important to understand that just like with student loans or any other loan, you might have, any financing agreement, the longer you defer that payment out, it does add cost to the transaction. So just be aware of that in your budget planning. Our bridge to grant solution, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and I think there's some great future discussion to be had on this one as we got to engage more with the NIH team yesterday and picking Susan's brain about this a little bit. But S10s are that program's becoming increasingly more competitive. And what we have seen is some demand from our clients that know that they want to invest in an instrument. They are planning to make that instrument a permanent part of their core facility. But they want to get in and start building the data set now as part of that S10 application. And there are provisions, if you read the circular, there are provisions within the S10 call for proposals that does give some pretty straightforward guidance on what's allowable and what's not allowable with leased equipment. So I will just touch on what's available to you all publicly, and then like most things with those applications, I think the most important piece to that is maintaining very transparent contact with both your institutional program officers and the NIH program officers as you're preparing that. But if you look at what the provisions are there, submitting an application with the intent to lease a piece of equipment is typically not going to be allowable. However, if you are already leasing a piece of equipment and you are not obligated to buy that piece of equipment through the lease, those costs can be considered under the grant. There are, like most things, letters of support, right? So you think about from the vendors and from your institutional colleagues where you may need letters of support for that application. This is an area where I would say this is important. You're going to want a letter from the supplier stating that the equipment that is under lease is in fact still state-of-the-art and will be state-of-the-art when funding decisions are made. So that's an important consideration right there. I think another important piece to this conversation today is what a lease is not, is just as important as what it is. And we do very commonly engage in discussions where, and we've even had this conversation with the Rutgers team and have learned more about this over the years, but there's inherently an interest with folks in this room, in this audience, hey, can we lease the equipment for 2 years while we're applying for our NIH, and then if we don't get the funding, we just want to return it. I would say the quick answer to that is that possible? Yes, it is. Is it economically viable? Solely my opinion, not really. Because when you're entering into a lease agreement, and I think this is really important to understand, lease-based refresh programs, these are hell or high water agreements that your institution is entering into. So in very rare cases is there an ability to enter into a lease for a piece of equipment and then decide in a year and a half that this is really not working for us and we don't want it anymore and we just want to send it back. There are providers that will do short-term rentals, 3 months, 6 months to try it out, to see if it's an investment you ultimately want to make, and then you can decide to lease the instrument after that. But I would just say be very wary when you're engaging with those providers of if it seems like it might be a lease, it probably is. If there's any obligation beyond, a short time, if there's any obligation beyond a 12-month time frame, it is very, very likely a lease that you're going to be obligated to. And there are different ways to dress this up. We've seen, 0% finance offers from suppliers. We've seen, 6-month same as cash that can convert to a lease. And those are all creative ideas, and they have their place, and we've helped institutions with those as well. But we just need to understand that as soon as a lender of any kind is supplying capital to the university, there is no free capital, right? If you find any, please let me know. Does that all make sense? Any questions on the short-term rentals? We will do a Q&A at the end, but I know that that's a specific area that comes up a bunch. Okay. Yes, you got it. And please speak up if there's anything we've got going here. So these are we were hoping to have one more gentleman joining us for our panel today from the Harvard Center for Biomedical Imaging. He's actually been running that facility now for the last 10 years. They've had a lease-based acquisition scheme as the primary funding source for that facility. But there are some excerpts from a white paper that he co-authored with a colleague from NYU. But this is where we're talking about maintaining competition risk, right? And in that particular facility, which we'll talk a little bit more before we wrap up, their sole objective has been to use this strategy as a way of growing and retaining the user base and combating technology obsolescence for, maybe equipment that we know we have a good track record with, suppliers that we have a good track record with and relationship with, but the technology cycles are starting to tighten and compress. So, it's not rocket science comparatively to what most of you are doing every day, right? But if we have, this is a conversation we recently had in the Pacific Northwest with 2 neighboring R1 universities, and one of their big challenges in their core facilities is we are still retaining our people, but we're losing all their user service fees to, big brother, big sister across the way because they have more advanced capabilities, and we're losing that potential user service revenue in-house. So, I think we've talked a good deal about this, but I do think Debbie will get a little bit more into timeframes and key considerations here. But this is really what you're thinking about when this consideration comes up in your core, on your campus, within your organization. It should really be designed with the end in mind. And what type of equipment are we looking to refresh? What's our desired useful life of that equipment? We were talking about this before the talk, right? If you want to lease hardware for your HPC upgrade, that may be a very different consideration than just swapping out a microscope. There's a lot of data transfer that needs to take place there. Servers need to stay on site, so having a solution in place, for HPC infrastructure where you have a drop-dead return date on that equipment at the very end of 3 or 4 years is probably not going to be very feasible, and it's going to add a bunch of costs for you at the end of the lease. So those are some of the things that you just want to be considerate of. What are the types of equipment we're considering this for, and where may it fit? And almost assuredly, unless you are doing a straight lease to own, if there are any end of lease implications for the university, you really want to work backward from what the end goal is in mind. And if you're not having conversations with folks that you're engaged with on this topic, and we're just kind of glossing over what happens at the end of the lease, that would be something that you'd want to make sure you're drilling in more detail on, for sure. We actually put this one in here in twice because we're gonna touch on it now, and then Debbie's gonna get into her case study, and then we're gonna circle back and figure out where all this ties in. But one of the primary goals of folks that are implementing these programs is they want to operationalize CapEx, and it's a very different budget model than most of your research administration is used to. So, I would say, and I think Debbie will attest to this, building the business case to start a program like this is much more cumbersome than once it's off the ground and rolling. So I think it's important here to understand what are the 3 primary lease structures that are really out there in the space. And they all have different objectives in mind. So your capital will start kind of on the far right and work our way over. But the capital lease over here with your dollar buyout at the end, this is pretty much a straight financing. We want to spread out costs. We want to align cost with useful life. We're going to own it at the end. Ownership of the asset transfers at the end. Very similar to a term loan. Your finance office, though, likes these because there are less stringent security requirements and things like that, you know, we won't go down that road. But they're used to doing, you know, general obligation bonds where they're pledging all the revenues of the university for 30 years on a large bond issuance. These are much less stringent. Typically, you're only secured by the equipment that you're actually financing. Okay. So also want to touch on this one, that this would be an example of if you're considering a bridge to an S10 or a bridge to an MRI, this is not a structure that would be in play because it's guaranteeing you ownership at the end of the lease, which is strictly prohibited under those guidelines. I would say on the other end of the spectrum here is your true lease. This is really your, for short-term assets, technology cycles are compressing. We really want to make sure that we're swapping this equipment out. And I would say this is going to be a best fit for assets that you want to swap out every 3 to 5 years. Again, we'll talk about the HCBI and what they're doing, but they effectively don't have a microscope in their facility that's older than 42 months old. Okay, so that's where you really want to be thoughtful. At the end of the lease, as opposed to the dollar buyout, you're going to have more optionality and flexibility here. So you will have the option to return the equipment, clean walk away at the end of the lease term. Again, understand if you're going to consider this for equipment in your core, that the lease end date is the date that the equipment is due back to the lessor. So how are you going to get it back? Is it feasible for you to decommission the equipment that soon? Do you need more time after the lease has ended to get it off campus? And do you have the white glove services available to do that swap? Can you recruit the OEM that's going to be bringing in the new equipment to take care of that disposition for you? Which is something that we've started to see more commonly and tried to work into some of the things that we're doing with Debbie's group. I would say that the return option is typically going to be most common. We will see folks that choose to maybe do a short-term rental at the end of a lease because, again, there may just be, we're not quite ready yet. We want to extend this for another 3 months, 6 months. That's usually a short-term rental extension. You really don't want to get into a spot where you're doing a 36-month, you know, refresh lease on something and then, hey, we want to extend it for 2 more years. Not going to be really economical for you down the road. And then do also have the option to buy the equipment. The caveat here is that if you purchase, if you enter into a true lease structure, I'm going to emphasize this. The intent should be that your desire is to refresh this equipment at the end of the lease. Because if you get into a situation where you're executing a buyout at the end of a true lease, a fair market value lease, typically the lessor is going to assess an in-place fair market value for that instrument. And I will tell you that an in-place fair market value for that instrument is going to be more costly than that instrument for sale on a secondary market. Okay, in-place value is always going to be higher. So this is not ideal. So the question becomes, and something that we've worked a bunch on over the years, is how do we bridge that gap with S10 where folks do want to get this equipment in the door, start building their data sets. They want that optionality. They need that optionality at the end of the lease, but we really want to reduce the liability here. And we need to have a known cost of ownership because when you're submitting your applications for those grants, you need to know what the lease payoff amount is going to be. So this is where you want to make sure that you're working to understand, again, what are our obligations going to be at the end of the lease? Do we have an open-ended option here? And is there a way to define this purchase option from the onset so we know what that cost is going to be to buy out of the lease from the onset? So hopefully that's a helpful high-level overview. And I'm going to transition it over here to Debbie. I would say the only other piece that I would want to touch on here, and this is, we'll be getting some follow-up information out to the membership. But when you're talking about this true lease option, this fixed purchase option, and the capital lease option, understanding the personal property tax implications in your state, which is not something that is a conversation that any of you probably have on a regular basis, nor anybody on your campus, because most of you are government entities or 501c3s, right? So property taxes is not something that you're used to paying. However, because title of the equipment in a lease agreement actually resides with the lessor until the end of the lease and an option is exercised, it's the lessor that is subject to the personal property taxes in that state. And there are some states where that personal property tax exemption passes through to the lessor if you're doing a lease for a 501c3 or a government entity. There are some states where it doesn't. So I mention that because if any of you were to, engage with somebody at a core facility for Yale, and you live in New York State's a very friendly state for leasing research instrumentation because that property tax exemption passes through to the lessor. The state of Connecticut is not so friendly. So the lessor is actually going to get a personal property tax assessment for ownership of that equipment. In my experience, I've not seen many lessors that necessarily disclose what those amounts are going to be up front or how that works. It's usually in the fine print, so it's just something you want to be aware of, because that if you are in a state where that's an implication, that invoice is going to be either A, billed against a PO requisition that you've already set up for the leasing company, or B, it's going to get sent to your tax office and work its way right down to you asking questions about what is this property tax invoice for? So I think that's just an important consideration to keep in mind as well. Good? All right, we're going to turn it over to Debbie.
So this is just to show you, and I think for many of you, maybe it's obvious, the types of equipment that we're looking at most recently for S10 awards, as well as other funding mechanisms to bring in new technology. And I'll go in and out of S10s. We've been very lucky with getting S10 grant awards, and of course there are other sponsor mechanisms like NSF, the major research instrumentation grants, as well as others that we heard about in some earlier sessions here. So there are good opportunities for getting funding for high-end instruments. And if the need is there and you have strong NIH-funded programs, let's say for the NIH shared instrumentation grants, and they're funded to do the work, you can put in a strong case. And we've been really lucky with that, but that takes 1.5 to 2 years to get the instrument online. And then, as many of you know, the really advanced scientific instrumentation now requires renovations and site preparation, and costs that also are adding to this whole scenario. And we've gotten into the chicken and the egg where we needed a high-end MRI for our neurobiologists. So we tried S10, and they said, well, you don't have the money to renovate the space to support the MRI. So then we tried the CO6, and you don't have the money to buy the MRI. So you can imagine the flexibility of being able to bring in other funding sources like a lease. Maybe we can go into an S10, a CO6 next time and say we're committed to leasing an MRI if we get the grant. And that gives you a lot more flexibility. And actually leadership has liked that solution because money is tight. So if you don't have to put money up front to buy an instrument outright, and you can spread it over time, it is costly. It does, cost more because of the finance and the agreement rates, but you still aren't having the full impact of that cost. And there's a formula, it seems these days. Most of the high-end instrumentation that I'm looking at is like easily $500,000, or at least $350,000 to $500,000, and the MRIs are up to $2 to $3 million for a very high-end MRI. So you can imagine it's a really big challenge. And like anything that we do as core facilities, there's a lot of business persuasion that we have to go through, a process to convince finance that it's viable. We have the user base. Even if there is an investment, it can ultimately be covered by user fees. And then what is that investment to get started, and who can provide funds for that? So of course we really do always look to sponsored programs. I look to the chancellor. We're very lucky. Our state has a lot of strategic funds that they give to higher education. So there are a lot of funding sources for us, as well as the revenue the core facility brings in, or the grants themselves that bring into the university. It's tight. So like anything else, the more participants you have in contributing to the purchase of something, the more likely you're going to get it. And we've done actually leases with flow cytometers, genomics genomic next-generation sequencers, and we're also looking now at other leasing solutions for some of the other things. So one of the interesting things is we have a preclinical imaging core. It's very new for us. Rutgers has a large Rutgers university level core, but we have something local now in our animal facilities. This is the core we wanted to get an MRI in. We were very lucky. We got an S10 for a MyLab's SPECT, micro CT SPECT PET imaging system for small animal models. But one of the reasons that we got it is we don't, for the PET probes, you need radionuclide probes. We don't have a cycler nearby to get those probes made, and then many of them are short-lived. So we made the promise as an institution to NIH that we would buy a in the box radionuclide conjugation system that would enable us to conjugate to peptides, drugs, the radionuclide probes we would need to do PET imaging. Well, we got the grant. We wrote the grant, I think 6 years ago now. It took us 3 years to get the grant. So by the time we got the grant and spent all that money to renovate the space to support the instrument, that commitment to buy that radionuclide system was still in place, but the money wasn't there. So I am looking to Lease now because we do need it and the programs need it. And I'm not going to convince anybody to come up with that money. There wasn't a business plan for it. It was an institutional support made a long time ago. So it does give you a lot of flexibility. It's not an inexpensive solution, but I think it's a cost. It's actually a value prop. It's very valuable because you're getting online quickly. You have the continuity. You can increase the innovation of your research quickly and keep up with the pace of the growth that's happening around you. And it's really critical that they're in the core facilities because we can then ensure that we're utilizing them well, financing them well, and when we're not financing, we have, our cores actually are overseen by me and in the dean's office, or I have very good finance people in the dean's office under our CFO that helps with this whole process. So we have built a good core research administration finance team that helps the course directors and scientists in the course as well as our faculty to really support this and advance these. And leasing now has become a very important consideration in that process. I ask money from a lot of people, and many of them will give me some. So it's how you add it up that matters, right? So I'm going to give you a test case just to give you a sense of the challenges and the workflow. And we have developed a team now with all the stakeholders. So I think our next set of leases are going to go much faster, but we had a lot of challenges in the last couple of rounds of leasing. And that's because financial times are hard. The vendors making changes to how they wanted these agreements to look like. The First American has their requirements. Our university is trying to centralize things, make things more reportable, more trackable, and save funds or be very cautious with spending discretionary funds. So we have a lot of challenges, and they've been putting a lot of different processes on the fly. So we've gotten a lot of curveballs, but we've actually, because we now have a very good team of all the stakeholders, have been able to respond quickly, and I think we've built a team that's going to be ready to respond even better in the future. So the case study I'm going to talk about really you start off with identifying the needs. And as you know, most of the time the faculty come to you and say, we need this, my research needs this. Other times we're at ABRF and we see this amazing technology and we go to our faculty and say, this is a good solution. Or we go to our leadership and we say, this is critical if we want to stay competitive or if we want to answer the types of research, biomedical questions that we're asking. So it really depends on what the need is, where it starts, and what's critical in terms of getting things on board or getting people on board to meet that need. And many times, like I said, the faculty come to us and we say, okay, we're going to write an S10, and we're good at it. But these days, that's not necessarily an option. And getting it in the door quickly is one of the reasons the leasing helps a lot in that. So like I said, we're recruiting, we're advancing technology, we have a lot of challenges, and then sometimes it's a critical replacement. So we had an IVIS imaging system, so that's optical imaging, live animal optical imaging, and we had an IVIS system from PerkinElmer that was 20 years old and the greatest of workhorses, and then it failed. So we reached out to one of our partner units at Rutgers, and they had an old one, very comparable. They weren't using, they sent it to us, and we got through a few, maybe another year, and it failed. And now I have federal funded programs that use it almost every day or every other day, and they're panicked. So we actually moved very fast this last year, at the end of last year, to mobilize to get everybody on board to get a lease to replace that critical equipment. Now we are thinking maybe we could apply to NIH and present the case that this was urgent and critical for these NIH-funded programs, and the university was willing to invest up front. And when we talked to the program manager and other people from NIH, as well as other people with experience on the review panels, it is a hard case, but it is eligible for funding. And if the institution is willing to put up 1 or 2 years of funding to get the lease in place, and you're awarded, you can use the grant award to pay the balance of the lease for the cost of the equipment. And I think we haven't tried it. We're going to try it actually with two different case scenarios. One was a critical replacement, and one was a technology that were behind the curve because many of the medical schools and other universities have already invested in it. So we're trying to use that option for both. Maybe next year I'll have some news on whether it worked, but we're hopeful, and we definitely think it's worth the effort. And then often the leadership will be more willing to fund if you've made the effort to write a grant, at least in my experience, and if you've got a good score but didn't get funded. That's really a great case to bring to leadership, because they see that there's peer review. This is valuable, and this will advance the research. So we've had some luck with getting those buy-ins, and actually one of the ones that we're going in for Nest 10 now had a chancellor support for the first 2 years of the lease payments. And so they supported half and the dean supported half, and we did an MOU and everybody was happy. So we're hoping to present that to NIH as a real commitment to the university. Even though we didn't have the money, we found a way to get it started. So like I said, we'll see. But either way, we have that technology in, and it's advancing our research very quickly, and we were lucky because we have the user base. So the user base was asking for it. And in one case, the technology had advanced, and it was like it could replace a failing instrument, so it was like a critical replacement, but also the technology was more advanced. It would bring us to a higher level of excellence. So it was, in our minds, whether we get the grant or not, it was really a great direction to take. So identifying different opportunities, and there's actually quite many more instrumentation grant opportunities than I was aware of. The VA has one, NIH, Mental Health Institute has one, specialized. So there's growing support for this, but as we know, if any of you guys have gotten S10s, they're just an amazing opportunity, and they really can make a huge difference. So finding the opportunities that are out there, working on institutional support, getting a lot of different stakeholders involved. And in one case where we had a critical instrument, the faculty wrote an equipment supplement grant for their R01, and they got monies, and they bought the instrument, but the instrument did not have the dynamic range they needed. So we actually leveraged the DoD funds. We reached out to DoD, and we said, if we get a higher end instrument and we do a lease and the university commits to the balance of it, could we apply the DoD funds to the lease? And they said yes. And I was a little shocked, because I've been always raised on, you don't lease if you want to get a grant, right? It's kind of I don't know, a word you don't use. So it's changing, and I think maybe it's changing, or maybe we're asking the right questions, right? And then, as I said, solicit financial support. And I don't know if you guys experience this. We have very strong business plans for our cores. Our cores meet every 2 years to review the rates, but we also, if we're advancing technologies, we meet with our finance person, and we have one finance person that's really well trained on this now, because she's learned from us and we've learned from her. She works with us monthly, quarterly, whatever we need. So we might be, we might have to do replacement of positions. How do we do that? How does that fit into the core finances? Can we do it? Can we justify that? And right now, financially, replacing is just as hard as new hires. So we work really close with them, and with something like an investment of a new instrument, we really work very hard on them. And it's the same business plan that we do, but of course it's a projection of something new as well as existing. So it does take quite a bit. So having a good financial person that understands what you need scientifically and how important it is to invest to grow, because I've heard a lot about cores should come out even. Not if you're investing, not if you're at the cutting edge, but of course you can't you can't bring the university into debt, so you have to have a very flexible, fluid model and always work towards bringing that user base back, advancing research, but also bringing in revenue so you could support the core staff, the expertise that's in the staff. So very important considerations. Like I said, we built a process. Most of the time, the faculty come with us with, we want to do this. They've even got a quote in hand. The whole process, even with a grant, would be, okay, what is the instrument? What are all the features? How much does it cost? And the faculty researchers or the core scientists are the ones that really know all the options and criteria that you want to develop in that purchase, in that package. So I, as a research administrator, don't do that. The leasing agency doesn't do that. The faculty or our scientists in the core work directly with vendors to do that. When they come to us, they often have a quote that's for the instrument. And as you know, if you write an S10 grant or other types of funding agency equipment grants, you don't get funding for the service contracts. It's just for the equipment purchase. But for the lease, at least now, our university requires us to have service contracts to cover the entire lease. And so if you think about it, S10s, you commit to covering the entire lease with institutional funds. But our university goes even further and says we have to have that in that lease proposal. That is the full cost of our lease. I do like it because when everybody comes to a consensus and says yes, then we are covered for 5 years or 4 years or whatever. We generally have leases for 4 to 5 years. And so there's no worries and there's no big hits down the road. And then of course these costs are spread out monthly. So it is a good business plan if you can swing it in many ways. And so the team. So this has been a challenge, and I'm sure it's a challenge for you. Rutgers is huge, and it's changing, and the climate post-COVID, we have a lot of staff turnover. We're trying to train people. We're trying to build a relationship, and then somebody leaves, and then we're building the relationship again. So I think it's true of anything. A good relationship with the vendor, a good relationship with your leasing agent, a good relationship with procurement, and so on. The PI, the core director, the dean's office, really matters. And you don't need all the stakeholders in all at once, but what we're realizing is in the beginning, everybody should come on board, take a look at the scenario, what do we need, what do we want, how do we do it? And then we can break up into different groups. Our procurement didn't really have a good fluid leasing contract for scientific equipment before we started about 5 or 6 years ago. I think we really started to do that. But they recognized we were doing more of this, and as Nick said, the reporting feature. So they actually have a point of contact now. They work directly with us, and he's learning, we're learning, but I have a program manager in my office that's learned a lot over the years. She's not a scientist, but she helps support the cores. So she works with him, with the investigators, with leadership, and with leasing agent to put this all together. And I think that's critical. There's, like I said, each scenario is different, the fund sources are different, the way you're arranging is different. The vendor, I'm finding, are asking for new types of agreements to solidify certain aspects of this. Because financially, for them to give, to give a lease, the way it works is basically we agree to the lease, but the leasing agent creates a PO to purchase the instrument from the vendor. Then our PO is approved to purchase the instrument or lease the instrument from the leasing agent bank. So the company has a lag before they start to get us payments from us. And that used to be not as hard, but now with finance charges and costs and money being tight, it's harder for them to do that. So we've seen new agreements in that side of it. We've also seen new agreements at the university side. Like I said, they're trying to control this more, or at least centralize it, make it more coordinate. So in the process of leasing, in process of developing a lease, and it's very time dependent, and the scientists are like, we need it, we need it, we need it. There's been a lot of new activities and ideas that we've had to problem solve on. Having that team is really essential, and I guess it's a no-brainer. We all have that concept, but in the everyday life, we're running and trying to get things done fast, especially if we're trying to do research and keep competitive. And people are busy, and we don't necessarily bring all those people together. Also, I would say at some point, the faculty can come off of the team, right? They're busy, but they also, because this is really a business process, they don't understand it, and they don't really need to be involved as much. But often they've already built the relationship with the vendor, so the vendor keeps bringing them in, or the vendor keeps dropping us off. So it's really good to build that consensus early. Who's involved? How are we going to do it? And now that we have good players, we're actually going to try to write that process out, so it really helps inform people in the future. Okay, so the business plan. So as we recruit new faculty, we actually have been able to negotiate for new funds, for instruments, for that faculty's program, but with the understanding it would be in a core facility. And in the old days, we used to do this, but then the faculty never let anybody else use it. We're not letting that happen anymore. And maybe they didn't let them use it, but it just sometimes really excellent equipment would just sit there. So having the core facility management and scientific expertise really helps us to optimize the use of the instrument. So there's an advantage to developing a business plan within the core for these types of purchases, and even just centralize the purchasing order of it. Like it used to be the departments. Now I have it in the dean's office, so I have my program manager, and she has 2 staff that help us track all these purchases, both strategic purchases with university funds as well as leasing funds, and that's helped a lot. It's helped us really be more efficient at it, and of course, finding the funds, getting a grant or a lease, and then getting it on board in the institution. Delivery, the logistics of delivery, the logistics of site prep, all of that now is under the dean's office, so I can help, and the dean's authority can go a long way to help the faculty, to help the department. So I do like that model. It does require a workforce to keep that tracking, and probably software in the future to help us with that. And I think that we can promote a lot of cost savings and flexibility. So our finance office, like us, are learning, and I think they're beginning to see the business case for this. When we first started, it was very hard. Affirm leadership support. So I don't know if you deal with this, but as a research dean, this is the scenario. I go to the senior associate research dean. I say, we really need this, and he says, yes, let's do it. And then I go to finance. I have a very good relationship with the CFO, and he says, yes, it sounds like we should do this. And then there are many yeses or nos along the way. Okay, yes, you should do it, and yes, that looks good, and yes, but I need this, and yes, but how about that? And it's on and on and on. So be aware of that. You're gonna, and it's hard for the faculty because they'll still hear we had a yes, and they're like, well, why don't you have it? Because it's complex, and getting money from multiple sources, even if it's best intended, is not easy. It's not easy for any of the units if they don't have it budgeted, and many of these strategic buys are not budgeted. So you're kind of moving around or asking money from many people. I do a good job, but I am lucky. I have many good partners that are really invested in this. And my core staff, or the university, or the school's core staff, are exceptional, and they are incredibly important partners in this process. Choice of lease options. So Nick described the three main lease options that are available for this type of thing. So the dollar buyout, I've only used recently for, it was a X-ray diffractometer that, again, lasted 25 years. And this thing, I don't expect any new technologies. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think we're going to do like a buyout and upgrade. So I thought the dollar buyout was the best option. It is a little bit more money than the fixed lease, but it affirms that it's ours, we're committed to it, and it's here to stay. And so for certain types of equipment, that I think is the best option. I favor that. The fixed rate lease is really the best option if you're going to consider an S10. It gives you flexibility, and I'll talk about a case study where we could actually do a buyout and upgrade to the next instrument, and it was a big win. But it is a commitment. And it's a commitment to the fifth, so we do 5-year leases, you're paying monthly payments, and the 5th year, you either buy out the rest of the lease up front, January 1 or whatever July 1 or whatever your lease started, or not, but you still owe that value. So if you don't buy it out, the leasing agent can get fair market value, and then you pay the difference. But you're still committed to the full cost, the full 5 years of that lease commitment. So it's a hard hit financially if you have to come up with a year's payment for the last year if you want to keep the instrument. At that point, it is worth considering a buyout. And like Nick was saying, it's not a commitment to buy. So NIH does recognize that as a feasible mechanism that can be funded if you can make that strong case. And remember, the case has to be made to the financial side of NIH, but also the research review panel. And our scientists are not used to this mechanism, so there's still a misunderstanding. Well, if you've leased it, you have it. They're going to pay for it. So trying to say that we're not going to pay for it and we're sending back is a hard case to make. But I would say that this particular instrument, the chancellor was very specific. We had an MOU that said 2 years and then all bets are off. So we can present that we were lucky. We got financial support to get on site now. It was critical, but we're not going to be able to sustain it if we don't get additional funds. I am hoping that sells. And then the procurement process, Nick described it a little bit. It's been changing for us, but now that we have a good team, it's really great. Like I said, the quote has to be the instrument plus the service contract. That's critical. And then this everybody has to approve. So sometimes I have to get the chair, the director, the dean, many stakeholders into that discussion, but we've been pretty successful with it. And now that we understand it within our institution, I really do think we're going to be able to do it better. One of the biggest challenges that we have had, too much? 2 minutes. Okay, is trying to fund, is trying to get a lease in place at the end of the year when there are great deals, but there's no time. So the vendor wants you to buy it by the end of December or mid-December, and our procurement is on holiday and everything's closed. So we've gotten a few of those through just by asking them to extend, but that is actually one very big challenge that we've had. So I only have a few minutes left, I think. Sorry. So Nick is going to talk a little bit about this more too. This is our business case for buying a next generation sequencer. So 5 years ago, or 4.5 years ago, we wanted to buy the next generation sequencer that's really high throughput, very expensive. It was over $1 million. And actually, at the time, it was really sold for clinical genomics, which we do have a diagnostic lab. So we could use it for clinical, but it wasn't appreciated how much it would support basic science. This instrument can do high throughput, and it can do several different methodologies in one run. So you could do RNA-seq, next generation whole genome sequencing. So the capability is tremendous. And we had to work very hard at the business case. This is sort of what we put together. This is the instrument cost. This is what we need to finance it. And then we also had to project. This is the user base is the kind of money we think we're going to bring in to convince our leadership and our finance offices that it was viable. It took quite a while, but now we find that there's the newer, version of this. It's faster, it's cheaper, it has high throughput. It's new chemistry. So it's very, very different, but it really is going to advance our research and save our faculty and our research-funded grant programs. Tremendous amount of money. So that was an easier case to present to finance, especially since we did the work in the early stages. And then we were lucky we negotiated, and this is really worth, like I said, talking to the vendor. We negotiated to keep the old instrument on site for 3 to 6 months with the new instrument side by side because of the new chemistry. So we had to finish out the current projects and start the new projects on the new technology. And they were very generous with that, even though the logistics, like I said, at the end of the year sale and the extensions and all of that. But it took a lot, and our core directors had to work very hard with the vendors to work those things out. But I think that's the kind of thing you can work with the vendor. It's not a guarantee that that will happen, but that continuity is critical. So I'm going to give it up to Nick, and he's going to describe more about what went into the business plans on the finance side.
We're gonna bring this part home quickly. This is the numbers fun, but I do think this is a very neat case study example because the other piece that Debbie didn't mention is the old equipment was actually coming off lease. So the previous equipment had been leased. We needed to get the new instrument placed, which was also going to be under lease. The vendor was trying to incentivize placing the new equipment, but there was still, you can see right here, there was still a balance on the existing lease of about $86,000. Okay, so we can't cancel that out. That is still owed on the lease, but the vendor came with a really aggressive trade-in credit on the new equipment. They were able to extend that quote. They were able to leave the equipment side by side. So those pieces were critical, but I think this was big for both Debbie to be able to make the financial case to her local leadership team, and then us having to help make the financial case to the university CFO, just so that they understand what's all going on here. Because what we, and basically, you know, I think the original instrument, the provider had offered a 0%, 3-year lease. We already talked about this. If you don't walk away with anything else today, there's no such thing as free money, so remember that in your negotiations. But what we were able to do was help support procurement to say, hey, there is no 0% financing. Typically what's happening in those scenarios is the OEM is just subsidizing the finance costs out. So what's going to happen on $1 million piece of instrumentation, if they want that to make it look like a 0%, effectively what's going to happen is the lessor is going to short pay the final invoice to the OEM. So it's still a great way to get things done and get things moving, but the challenger is I guess the opportunity there is if you understand how the underlying cost of the lease works. The original lease that we did, we actually were able to generate $60,000 in equipment savings for the university by unwinding that 0% offer and just lending it a true cost of capital on that original piece of equipment. The $86,000 is the balance that was owed on that lease. And then the vendor came in and basically they didn't know what was owed on the lease. We gave them an idea, but they didn't know. But they came in with a very aggressive trade-in credit on the instrument. So the net positive for Rutgers between the two leases on swapping out these instruments was about $160,000. So again, that's not, if you were to look at the lease from beginning and inception and if we plan to buy this out, what are the cost implications are going to be? Ended up looking very different at the end, more favorable to Rutgers than even where we were on the onset. So kind of a neat case there. And we'll end on this one because I think the reason we put this back in here is that most of the work we've been doing in the Rutgers portfolio, again, has been here to date. We are looking for opportunities in cores where we can move to the True Lease program. And this is the case study example, which this is actually a published paper. You can find this. It is called To Buy or to Lease. It was authored by a gentleman named Douglas Richardson, co-authored with a colleague of his at NYU. You can find this on EMBO. I believe they published it in 2020. But these are the summary points that I just wanted to highlight out of that case study. And I think one of the comments that stood out to me the most in his paper is that although these concepts are difficult to get initially maybe set up with your leadership because it's not a concept that they're used to, it really does give what is ultimately desired, which is a predictable operating budget for replacement of this equipment. So all instruments in their facility at the time this paper was published, replaced no sooner than 10 years, no later than 3 years. I think they may have extended that to 42 months at this point for certain instrumentation. They've passed 30 microscopes through the HCBI in the decade leading up to when this paper was published, and they've seen, obviously, you can see there from 200 to over 700 individual users per year through that facility. And then there's some, we will circulate these slides, but just in the interest of time and making sure we leave time for questions. You can see too some of the assumptions that are used in his model. I'll also tell you he did a fantastic job negotiating the residual. I would say the residual. So when you think about a car lease, right, your car lease payments are based on the residual investment that the dealer is making in that vehicle, with the expectation they're going to be able to get that car back and resell that and make their money back that way. It's a very similar concept here. So he's basically negotiated a blanket master program where the 3 primary vendors that he works with have all agreed to a shared residual risk model to give him a pretty predictable cost of ownership over the life. So with that said, I know we breezed through that last part, but we would be happy to open it up for any questions with the time we've got left.
So any questions? Mike's at the middle.
Hey, so obviously great bringing in new equipment. How are you handling situations where you're sort of strapped for staffing and ultimately bringing in that equipment is going to require somebody else to run it? Are you kind of negotiating that ahead of time with your institution, or are there like separate ways? Is it kind of, all right, now we have this equipment, now we go back and say, hey, we're bringing this new equipment, will you give us some more money to pay somebody to run it?
So that is definitely part of the business plan. The CFO will not accept it if we are not putting in all the costs. Sort of like a grant. When you put in a S10 grant, you really have to build that case, and then can the user fees support it, or does the institution have to cover it? And often with new technology, we have to commit to supporting it up front with the idea that we're building the user base over time and revenue will cover it. But yeah, it's got to be part of the business plan.
Timing commitments and pressures are a real thing, whether it's the grant application or just discounts that are going to be provided by OEMs. Can you talk a little bit about timing and that sort of process? And then, Nick, you had mentioned a little bit about the master lease agreement and finance. Like, when's the best time to engage the finance team on that side of the house?
Maybe it's just so contrary to popular belief that, like I alluded to earlier, we should get 90% of the way there and try to shotgun this thing through procurement at the last minute. I would say always earlier the better on these types of agreements. I think if this is a program that you think can be beneficial to your operations on your university, at your university, you should be engaging leadership on this topic to see if it's viable. Because the other thing you don't want to do is go on a goose chase for this and find out that the public institution that you work for has a debt policy provision that doesn't allow for leasing. And now you've gone down this road, and it's frankly a simple question to the Treasury that probably could have been asked. I think, frankly, there's a little bit of tentativeness when it comes to wanting to do that outreach so that we're not, doing anything we're not supposed to do, right? I think there is some of that sentiment, but I think, in our experience, I think that if you can engage financial leadership early to understand, is this a viable option? Typically, if that's a yes, it's viable, but there has to be a business case, then you have the blessing to go and build that business case. So I think timing is always before the need, kind of going down this road and doing the investigation is always best. And then I do think you just really have to understand requirements of the timing of when the supplier is going to need to be paid for the equipment, when is the equipment going to arrive, when do you have funding available to start those lease payments? I think those timing considerations are probably even more important. So hopefully that answers.
Also, I would add, if you would like to pursue an S10 with a lease mechanism, you want the lease in place before you apply, and it should not be close to application. You're better off just purchasing it at that point. So, but keep in mind, it needs to be cutting edge. So if you apply for an S10, say you get a lease and a year into it, you apply for an S10, it gives you a lot of time to build that proposal, those preliminary data, but it has to be truly state-of-the-art at award time, right? So you have to make that case, so think about that, because if it's really not state-of-the-art, or the technology is moving so fast, you're at risk.
So you say, make sure you're doing the lease before you put your grant application in. So what happens if it happens the opposite direction? So in my case, we had an unsuccessful, well-scored NSF MRI grant from a previous year, and then end of last year, we put in a follow-up, a second round of the NSF MRI. After putting that grant in, at the very end of the year, the particular sales came back with a very, very generous lease terms with that 0% APR, discounts, et cetera. So because we really urgently needed the instrument, although we hadn't had a path forward other than grant previously, we did opt to go ahead and enter into a lease with a business plan that assumed we would not get any grant money.
Okay.
Any experience with what's happened, whether it's DOD, NSF, NIH, with a scenario like that, and am I in trouble?
So am I hearing you correctly that in that scenario, you're still, your application's being reviewed and
We
you
expect
entered
to hear
into the
back
lease?
in May, yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna just venture to say, contact your program officer.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
really-
yeah. We
I do
haven't
really
got a
think
full
that's the- yes.
straight answer on that one. It's been back and forth.
It's,
so,
it's a good case to
It is.
defend, but you're gonna wanna talk with them.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, all right, thank you so much.
And I think in those cases, communication is just key. I think we've heard back very favorable. We just placed an instrument down at Huck at Penn State, year end, same type of thing. Year end incentive, they really wanted to get it in there. They were gonna be applying for S10. So similar type situation. But I do know they were actively in touch because we were providing, here are your potential buyout numbers in year one, here are your potential buyout numbers if you don't get it in year one and you do get it the second time around, and then here's what the lease would look like if you strike out both times, what it would look like, for the remaining 3 years. But I do know they were in very close touch with their program officer as they were pulling that application together before entering into the lease. So that would be the recommendation, but I would just say, contact them and see.
Hi, I'm Franklin Nouvet from Harry Medical
I was hoping for
College.
2 questions at the same time. That would have been fun.
Yeah, Nashville, Tennessee. So small institution, we have multiple cores that have consolidated into one central core. So I'm the lab, the core manager. And we have sub-core directors like microscopists and we have a confocal microscope that's probably the most used instrument in the core, and it's on its way down. It's a Nikon top of the line, but it's been there for, I think it's somewhere about 12, 13 years now. And I keep telling the microscopy subcore director that, that instrument is no longer supported by Nikon. And it's a long-term kind of forethought, but they're telling, I've been told that unless the instrument is down and no longer operational, that you can't really write a grant to request another instrument to replace an existing instrument that actually works. Is that accurate, and what options do we have?
So I do think it's a hard case. Again, sometimes it's scientific review panel that's harder on it than the business side of the sponsor. But I would say if the manufacturer is no longer going to support it, that's a very strong case.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay. So for like an S10 grant or something like that?
Yeah,
or?
exactly,
Okay.
S10. I think MRI would, NSF grants would be the same. Because, you can't keep excellence in research, support the advancement of research with something that's not supported by the manufacturer. So I think that's a really strong case.
And that was, I think those comments were echoed. Debbie and I had a good sit down with Susan yesterday and got into some of these topics because we really valued her insight, given her experience with the S10 program. But I just think in that scenario, some of the comments that she shared with us are you already have a strong user base built. Mm-hmm. There is demand for the instrument. and we're looking to keep state-of-the-art current technology. So I would echo Debbie's comments that that would seem to me like a very good candidate.
And ask the program officer.
And ask your program officer.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You got it.
Thank you. Very nice talk. Raju Tamantal from Seattle Children's. I saw the last slide that you had there
Yes.
about the finances, right?
Yes.
With an assumption that the average time is 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was just guessing it, right? You add all this 3 years expense together, and that was my concern. And didn't consider. I really am excited now to consider leasing, but my thought was that within 3 years you end up paying 80-90% of the cost of the equipment, right?
That can be the case.
Right.
That can
And
be
so
the case.
if I have an equipment that I might use for more than 5 years,
Right.
I might end up paying a lot more.
Correct.
Right.
And that's a very, very good point,
Yeah.
and something we want to stress, that these types of refresh programs are really not intended for assets you're planning to keep for more than 5 years.
So that's where the challenge is.
Yep.
Like, say, let's take the PerkinElmer or the animal imaging system. Pretty solid equipment, can go for 10 years plus. I would rather buy it if I have the money.
Yep.
I have the money.
Yep.
And take spatial biology, which nobody has any idea where you're going. But one thing I know, we ended up investing in spatial biology. Well, one thing I know is that my faculty said, well, it takes 1 to 2 years for us to figure out. But then we need the equipment for longer. So really the final question comes to, I'm trying to think loud here. Final question comes to this guesswork of, are we going to keep this machine for more than 3 years? Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big driver. I do.
Okay.
I think the desired useful life of the equipment, I think 3 years, I think you've got to be careful setting this is the magic number, because I do think that if it's an unproven technology, right, where there's
Right.
maybe not a firm understanding of what is the secondary market
Mm-hmm.
for a 4-year-old or 5-year-old one of these instruments versus a, not top-of-the-line Nikon confocal, which is
Right.
very well established. We understand that marketplace. Most lessors do. That may be something where, and I can attest to it in this case, there are more aggressive residual positions in this equipment, which makes it favorable 3 years, 4 years, even if they were to stretch to 5 years, could probably
Okay.
get into a pretty favorable scenario. So no, I think that's a great question. I also think whether it's leasing research instrumentation or just leasing regular IT, I think one of the hardest costs to account for is your soft costs related to managing equipment that's out of service, beyond service contract, right, or maybe out of warranty, because there are costs inherently associated with continuing to manage older equipment that may not be supported as strongly. So,
So the service contract is still the same. You have to buy it. The institution has to purchase it. Whether
at
you-
Rutgers University, they do require a
Right.
OEM provided
Right,
service
whether you,
contract.
yeah,
correct.
okay. I mean,
You guys don't require it, right? The leasing agent
No,
doesn't.
that's not a First American
It-
requirement. That's
Okay.
But
Rutgers
I
University.
think you're right, it's really tricky, right? How do you determine the fair market value of a new instrument or, an emerging technology? And
Right.
I think that's where you have to really consult the scientists, even the vendors and, what technologies they're advancing.
Yeah.
But it is a risk. I think the vendor and also the banking company can help you with determining fair market value, but it's still an approximation, right? I mean, who knew there would be, like I said, the next generation sequencer that was faster, cheaper? Who knew that was going to happen as soon as it did? It was 4 years and it emerged. I mean, you could predict that because that's a very rapidly advancing technology. But like you said, spatial biology, none of us are sure the risk we're taking in investing. So it's that's a challenging one.
And I'm assuming then, when the technology is risky, those terms for leasing will also reflect that high risk.
Thank you. I think we are over time.
Oh, I see,
Please-
sorry.
Yeah,
No,
please,
it's a great question.
please, you can continue to engage the speakers. And thank you very much for coming in your time. The presenters are still here. We can continue the conversations at the closing session. Thank you.
Thank you.
beautiful.
Our business plan goes, we're not gonna make the grant, we budgeted, so that's okay.
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Right, so-
We can